The jungle of the island of Luzon in the Philippines is not merely a collection of trees and vines. It is a suffocating green ocean that covers the mountains of the central archipelago. It is a place where the sun struggles to touch the forest floor and where the humidity hangs in the air like a heavy wet blanket weighing down the lungs of any man foolish enough to try and march through it. It is a landscape that is alive with sound. The screaming of millions of cicadas, the call of strange tropical birds like the kalal with its loud honking cry, and the ceaseless rustle of monitor lizards moving through the rotting vegetation create a cacophony that never stops. To an outsider, particularly a Westerner, this jungle is chaotic and terrifying, a green hell where every leaf seems to hide a predator. To the men who live there, however, it is home. It is a fortress. It is the only safety they have ever known. It is the year 1952. The world is in the grip of the Cold War, but here in the jungle the war is hot and it is bloody. A patrol of rebel soldiers is moving through this darkness. They are men of the Hukbalahap army. They are communist guerrillas, but they do not look like the soldiers you see in the newsreels of World War II. They wear ragged clothes, stolen from farmers or scavenged from the dead. They wear flip-flops made from old car tires or go barefoot, their soles hardened like leather. They carry Japanese Asaka rifles, rusted from the humidity, and American carbines, stolen from police stations. They are thin, hard men with faces etched by years of hunger and resolve. They have survived the brutal Japanese occupation of the 1940s, and they are now fighting a desperate war against their own government. They know these trails better than anyone. They know which route will trip a man in the dark and which birds call out when strangers approach. They mock the government soldiers, calling them soft boys from the city who are afraid of the dark and who need trucks to move their supplies. The Huks move like ghosts. They can march 50 kilometers on a handful of rice. They are the masters of this terrain. But tonight the rebels are nervous. The confidence that usually marks their stride is gone. They are not afraid of the Philippine constabulary, the hated police force. They are not afraid of bullets or mortars or even the napalm that the Americans have started to supply. They are afraid of something that cannot be fought with a gun. They are afraid of something ancient. They have heard whispers from the villagers in the valley below. The old women in the market, usually reliable sources of intelligence about troop movements and supply convoys, have been talking about something else entirely. They speak in hushed, terrified tones, their eyes darting around to ensure no one is listening. They speak of an ancient evil that has returned to the mountain of Ariat. They speak of the Aswang. In Philippine folklore, the Aswang is a creature of pure primal nightmare. It is not the romantic vampire of Hollywood movies. It is not a handsome count in a cape. It is a shape-shifting monster of grotesque appetite. By day, it might appear as a normal human, a quiet neighbor, or a shy shopkeeper who avoids eye contact and lives at the edge of the village. But by night, it transforms. It can become a bat or a large black bird or a huge dog with burning red eyes. It has a long proboscis like a mosquito but made of flesh, which it uses to probe into bamboo houses while the occupants sleep. It feasts on the unborn fetuses of pregnant women, sucking them out of the womb with a long hollow tongue. It hunts the sick, the weak, and the isolated. And most terrifying of all for the men in the jungle, it drains the blood of the living, leaving them as dry, pale husks. The rebel commander, a veteran of 100 firefights named Diego, tells his men to keep moving. He hisses at them to be quiet. He strikes a match to light a cigarette and sees the fear in their eyes. He tells them that the Aswang is a fairy tale for children, a story told by grandmothers to keep little ones from wandering into the forest. He tells them to focus on the mission. They are moving along a narrow ridge aiming to ambush a government convoy at dawn on the highway below. The vegetation is so thick that it blocks out the moon entirely. The only light comes from the faint bioluminescent glow of decaying fungi on the jungle floor, a ghostly green light that does little to comfort them. The patrol walks in a single file line. This is standard military doctrine, to minimize noise and to leave a smaller trail for the government trackers. The last man in the line is a young fighter named Mateo. He is only 19 years old. He joined the rebellion after his father was beaten to death by landlord thugs for asking for a larger share of the harvest. Mateo is brave in a firefight. He has killed men before, but tonight he is trembling. He keeps checking behind him. The jungle feels different tonight. The air feels colder. He feels eyes watching him from the canopy above. He grips his rifle until his knuckles are white, the wood slippery with his sweat. Suddenly there is a rustle in the bushes. It is not the wind. The air is perfectly still, stagnant and heavy. It is a sharp, deliberate movement like a dry branch snapping under a heavy foot. The man in front of Mateo keeps walking, oblivious, focused on the back of the man in front of him. Mateo stops. He turns to look. He strains his eyes against the crushing blackness. He sees nothing but the tangled shapes of vines and ferns. He tells himself it is a wild pig or a monkey. But then he smells it. A strange musky scent. Not the smell of an animal, but the smell of something old. In a split second, a pair of strong gloved hands grabs him from the darkness. He does not even have time to scream. A hand clamps over his mouth, stifling his cry, turning it into a muffled gurgle. He is dragged silently and violently into the undergrowth. The jungle swallows him whole. The leaves close behind him as if he never existed. The rest of the patrol keeps walking. They do not hear a thing over the drone of the insects. They walk for another 10 minutes, covering perhaps half a kilometer, before the man second to the last turns around to whisper to his comrade, asking for a sip of water. He sees nothing but empty air. He stops the line. He signals the others. They hiss into the darkness. They call the name of the missing man. Mateo! Mateo! There is no answer. Only the buzzing of the cicadas and the distant, mournful cry of a night bird. The silence that follows is heavier than the heat. Fear begins to set in like a cold poison. It starts in the stomach and spreads to the limbs. They backtrack. They search the trail, sweeping their flashlights nervously, the beams cutting through the mist. A few hundred yards back, they find him. Mateo is lying on the path. He is dead. But it is not the death of war. He has not been shot. He has not been stabbed with a bayonet. His skin is pale, white, drained of every single drop of color, looking like marble in the moonlight. His eyes are wide open, frozen in a mask of absolute terror, staring up at the canopy, as if he saw something horrific in his final moments. And on his neck, right over the jugular vein, there are 2 puncture marks. 2 round, clean holes, perfectly spaced. There is no blood on the ground. There is no blood on his shirt. It is as if he has been drunk dry. The rebel soldiers stare at the body. They cross themselves, instinctively reverting to the Catholicism of their childhoods. They do not look for enemy footprints. They do not look for spent shell casings. They look at the sky. They look at the dark shapes of the bats circling above the trees. The commander Cardiego tries to maintain order, but his voice is shaking. The political officer, who usually reads to them from the Communist Manifesto, tries to speak, but the words die in his throat. The men know what this is. It is not the Philippine army. It is not the Americans. It is the Aswang. The monster is real, and it is hunting them. By the next morning, the entire squadron has fled the region. They refuse to fight on that mountain. They retreat to the lowlands, abandoning their stronghold and their strategic advantage. They tell the other squadrons what they saw. The fear spreads like a virus. The Philippine government secures the area without firing a single shot. Thousands of miles away, in a nondescript office in Washington, D.C., a report lands on a heavy oak desk. It details the success of the operation. The vampire has struck. The enemy has fled. The man who orchestrated this operation was not a wizard or priest. He was not a monster hunter. He was an American spy named Edward Lansdale. He was a former advertising executive from California who realized that the most powerful weapon in war is not a gun or a bomb. It is a story. This is the story of Operation Vampire. It is the story of how the CIA weaponized folklore. It is the story of how the United States learned to fight a new kind of war in the shadows, using ghosts, demons, and superstition to break the mind of the enemy. And it is the story of the moral line that was crossed in the deep jungles of the Philippines, a line that would lead America directly into the tragedy of Vietnam. To understand why the CIA was faking vampire attacks in the 1950s, we have to understand the world in which Edward Lansdale lived. We have to go back to the ashes of World War II and the turbulent, violent history of the Philippines. The Philippines had been an American colony for nearly 50 years. The United States had purchased the islands from Spain in 1898, like a piece of furniture for $20 million. They famously described their rule as 300 years in a Catholic convent followed by 50 years in Hollywood. The Americans brought public schools and baseball and jazz and cars, but they also entrenched the power of the wealthy landowning families. They created a society where a tiny elite owned the land and millions of peasants worked it in near slavery. This inequality was the fuel that would eventually burn the country down. When the Japanese invaded in 1940, food was scarce. Torture was common, but they did not give up. In the countryside, the peasants formed armies to fight the Japanese. The largest and most effective of these armies was the Hukbalahap. The name is a contraction of a Tagalog phrase meaning, the nation's army against the Japanese. The Huks were brave. They were ruthless. They harassed the Japanese supply lines and protected the farmers from having their crops stolen by the invaders. They believed that when the Americans returned, they would be hailed as heroes. They believed that their sacrifice would be rewarded with land reform. They believed that the old feudal system of landlords and peasants would be abolished and a new fair society would be built. But when General Douglas MacArthur returned and the war ended, the Huks were not treated as heroes. The American government was terrified of communism. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence. The Huks were led by socialists and communists, men who read Marx and Lenin. To the Americans, they were no longer allies. They were the new enemy. The United States backed the new Philippine government, which was dominated by the same wealthy landowners who had collaborated with the Japanese. The peasants who had fought for freedom found themselves back in the same poverty they had endured before the war. They were told to give up their guns and go back to working the fields for starvation wages. They refused. The Hukbalahap reorganized. They changed their name to the People's Liberation Army, but everyone still called them the Huks. They retreated into the mountains in the swamps of central Luzon, a region known as the Rice Bowl of the Philippines. They declared war on the Philippine government. By 1950, the situation was desperate. The Huks were winning. They had over 15,000 armed fighters and a support base of over 2 million peasants. They controlled huge swaths of the main island of Luzon. They were knocking on the doors of the capital city, Manila. They were assassinating police chiefs and ambushing army convoys. The Philippine army was useless against them. The army was corrupt, poorly trained, and brutal. When the army entered a village to look for rebels, they would steal chickens, abuse the women, and burn down houses. This only made the peasants hate the government more. The Huks were seen as the protectors of the people. They were the Robin Hoods of the rice paddies. Washington was in a panic. China had just fallen to the communists in 1949. The Korean War had just started. The fear was known as the domino theory. If the Philippines fell to the communists, then all of Southeast Asia would follow. The Pacific Ocean would become a communist lake. The CIA knew they couldn't just send in the Marines. That would look like an invasion. It would validate the communist propaganda that America was an imperialist power. It would turn the Philippine people against the US. They needed to win the war from the inside. They needed a man who understood how to change the way people think. Enter Edward Lansdale. Lansdale was not your typical spy. He was not an Ivy League blue blood like the men who founded the CIA. He was a regular guy from California. Before the war, he had worked in advertising. He had sold Levi's jeans and Wells Fargo banking services. He wrote radio jingles. He understood that people do not buy products based on logic. They buy products based on emotion. They buy based on their dreams and their fears. He knew that if you could tell a good enough story, you could sell anything, even a war. Lansdale joined the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA during World War II. He served in the Pacific. He fell in love with the Philippines. He learned the culture. He roamed the countryside, talking to farmers and shopkeepers, drinking coffee in roadside shacks. He was known as the ugly American, but in the original sense of the phrase, meaning a rough and ready man who got things done, not the insult it later became. He played the harmonica. He listened. In 1950, the CIA sent Lansdale back to the Philippines with a secret mission: destroy the Huks, save the government, do whatever it takes. Lansdale arrived in Manila with a suitcase full of cash and a head full of ideas. He looked at the Philippine army and he was disgusted. He saw them using conventional tactics against a guerrilla force. They were trying to smash a mosquito with a hammer. Every time they bombed a village, they created 10 new rebels. Lansdale found a partner in the Philippine government, a man named Ramon Magsaysay. Magsaysay was the Secretary of National Defense. He was a big, charismatic man who had been a guerrilla fighter himself. He was honest, which was rare in Manila politics. Lansdale and Magsaysay became inseparable. They were like brothers. Lansdale was the brain and Magsaysay was the face. Lansdale told Magsaysay that they had to stop killing the peasants. They had to win their hearts and minds. He famously said that the most important weapon in the fight against communism was the smile. But Lansdale also knew that smiles were not enough. He needed to terrify the enemy. He needed to use psychological warfare or Psy-war. He needed to make the enemy feel unsafe in their own homes. Lansdale set up a secret unit called the Civil Affairs Office. It was a cover for his psychological operations team. He recruited writers, artists, and students. He told them to study the culture of the Filipino peasant. He didn't want military intelligence regarding troop numbers. He wanted cultural intelligence. He wanted to know their superstitions. He wanted to know what kept them awake at night. He wanted to know the monsters of their childhood. This brings us back to the jungle and the vampire. Lansdale realized that the Huks were invincible in their mountain strongholds. The army couldn't find them in the dense jungle. But the Huks were mostly uneducated peasants from the provinces. They were brave fighters, but they were deeply superstitious. They carried amulets called anting, pieces of brass or bone, inscribed with Latin prayers to protect them from bullets. They believed in spirits dwelling in the ballet trees. They believed that the night was full of monsters. Lansdale decided to turn their own beliefs against them. He decided to stage a horror movie in real life. The planning for Operation Vampire was meticulous. Lansdale did not want it to look like a military operation. It had to look like a supernatural event. His team identified a specific Huk squadron that was entrenched on a hill called Raid. This hill was strategic. It is a lone dormant volcano rising out of the flat plains of Luzon. From there, the Huks could launch raids on the rice fields and retreat to the safety of the lava caves. The army had tried to dislodge them for months and failed. Lansdale's team went into the villages surrounding the hill. They started a rumor campaign. This is the first step of any psyop. You have to see the narrative. His agents disguised as woodcutters or merchants would sit in the village markets. They would whisper to the locals. They would say, "Have you heard? The Aswang is back." They would say, "My cousin saw it. It was flying over the mountain. It was huge. It had wings like leather. It was bigger than a man. It looked like a giant bat." The rumors spread like wildfire. In the Philippines, gossip is a powerful force. Within a week, everyone in the valley was talking about the Aswang. The villagers started closing their windows early. They painted white crosses on their doors. They hung garlic and salt packets from their rafters. They stopped going into the forest at night. The Huk fighters on the mountain heard these rumors. At first, they laughed. Their political officers, who were trained in Marxist theory, told them that ghosts did not exist. They told them that religion and superstition were the opiates of the masses. They told them that the Aswang was a myth created by the Spanish friars to scare children into obedience. But when you're sitting in the dark jungle at 2 in the morning, Marx does not offer much comfort. The jungle plays tricks on the mind. The shadows move. The wind sounds like a voice. The Huks began to feel uneasy. They began to sleep in shifts. Lansdale waited until the fear had reached a boiling point. Then he ordered the strike. He selected a special squad of Philippine Army commandos. These were not ordinary conscripts. These were the Scout Rangers, tough men who could move silently in the bush. Lansdale trained them personally. He taught them exactly what to do. He rehearsed the operation like a play. He gave them a specific tool, a medical device used for draining fluids. It was a simple suction device with 2 sharp needles. The commandos moved into position on a moonless night. They waited for a Huk patrol to pass. This was the moment described at the beginning of our story. The snatch had to be perfect. If the rebel soldier managed to fire his gun, the illusion would be broken. If he screamed too loud, it would just be a battle. It had to be a disappearance. It had to be supernatural. When the commandos grabbed the last man in the line, they dragged him deep into the forest. They killed him quickly to minimize the struggle, usually with a sharp blow to the head or a knife to the heart. And then the macabre work began. They used the device to puncture the neck. They had to be precise. The holes had to look like bite marks from a large creature. They could not look like bayonet wounds. They spaced them perfectly apart to mimic the fangs of the Aswang. Then they drained the blood. They hung the body upside down so gravity would do the work. They wanted the corpse to be completely exsanguinated. A pale white husk. This process took time. It required a cold detachment. This was the genius of Lansdale's cruelty. A bullet wound is a soldier's death. It is honorable. It is expected. But a body drained of blood is a primal horror. It speaks to a fear that goes back to the Stone Age. It suggests that the enemy is not human. You cannot fight a monster with an old rifle. They left the body on the trail where it would be found. When the Huks found their comrade, the psychological impact was devastating. The political officers tried to explain it away, but they could not explain the lack of blood. They could not explain the bite marks. The squadron commander realized he had lost control of his men. They were terrified. They refused to stand guard duty at night. They huddled together in their camp. They jumped at every shadow. By the next evening, the Huks evacuated the hill. They moved down into the valley where they were vulnerable. The Philippine army was waiting for them. The squadron was decimated. Lansdale repeated this tactic in other regions. He varied the monster, depending on the local folklore. In some areas, they used the legend of the Tiyanak, a demon that takes the form of a crying baby to lure victims into the forest. Lansdale's team would hide in the bushes with a tape recording of a crying baby. When the Huk soldiers came to investigate, thinking they were rescuing an abandoned child, the commandos would ambush them. The survivors would run back to their camp, screaming that the forest was haunted by demons. But the vampire operation was just one part of a massive psychological assault. Lansdale was fighting a war on all fronts. He created the concept of the Eye of God. The Philippine Air Force had small planes called L-5 Sentinels that could fly low and slow over the villages. Lansdale had his team paint a giant eye on the underside of the wings, a single staring eye. He would have these planes fly over Huk villages on ominous cloudy days. Then he would have a voice broadcast from a loudspeaker on the plane. The voice would be deep and echoing. It would say the names of the Huk commanders. It would say, "We see you. We know what you have done. Your time is coming." Imagine being a peasant in 1952. You live in a bamboo hut. You have little contact with the outside world. Suddenly, a giant eye flies out of the clouds and calls you by your name. It was terrifying. It made the rebels feel like there was no place to hide. It made them feel that the government had supernatural powers. It broke their sense of security. Lansdale also used what he called the ghost broadcasts. He knew that the Huks would hide in the jungle for weeks at a time. They were lonely. They missed their families. They were hungry. Lansdale's team would fly planes slowly over the jungle at night. They would play recordings over powerful speakers. But they weren't messages from the government. They were messages from the dead. Lansdale hired voice actors to mimic the voices of dead Huk rebels. The recordings were chilling. They would have spooky background music and the sound of wailing wind. The voice would say, "My brothers, why did you let me die? I'm cold. I'm hungry. There's no revolution in the afterlife. Go home. Go home to your mothers. Do not die like I did." These ghost tapes played on the immense guilt that survivors felt. It demoralized the fighters. Desertion skyrocketed. Rebels would walk out of the jungle with their hands up crying, saying they couldn't take the voices anymore. They surrendered not because they were outgunned, but because they were haunted. Perhaps the most theatrical operation was the Asadillo Psyop. Asadillo was a famous bandit leader who had been killed years earlier in the province of Laguna. He was a local hero, a Robin Hood figure, and many peasants believed his spirit still watched over them. Lansdale decided to resurrect him. He learned that the Huks in that region were using Asadillo's legend to recruit followers, claiming that Asadillo's spirit supported the communists. Lansdale sent his team into the forest with hidden loudspeakers. On a foggy night when the Huks were camped nearby, the team activated the speakers. They projected a voice that sounded like a ghostly old man. The voice claimed to be Asadillo. It spoke to the rebels directly. It said, "My children, you have lost your way. These men who lead you are not my followers. They are bandits who steal from the poor. Leave them. Return to your families." It was a seance conducted with military-grade electronics. And it worked. The rebels who respected the spirit of Asadillo more than they respected the Politburo began to defect. These operations, the vampire, the eye of God, the ghosts, were incredibly effective. But they were only half the battle. Lansdale knew that to truly win, he had to do more than scare the enemy. He had to offer them a better future. He had to sell them a product they actually wanted. And that product was a man named Ramon Magzis. To fully grasp the magnitude of Operation Vampire and the genius of Edward Lansdale, we must look beyond the horror of the jungle and into the bright lights of the political stage. Lansdale knew that fear was a powerful motivator, but hope was stronger. He had terrified the Huks with monsters, but now he had to offer them a savior. And that savior was Ramon Magzis. Lansdale looked at the political landscape of the Philippines and saw a swamp of corruption. The incumbent president Elpidio Quirino was a sick man surrounded by cronies. He represented the old guard, the wealthy elite who lived in walled compounds in Manila, while the rest of the country starved. The Huks were winning because they offered the only alternative to this corruption. Lansdale decided to manufacture a third option. He would take his friend Ramon Magzis, the Secretary of Defense, and mold him into the perfect candidate. Magzis was rough around the edges. He was a mechanic by trade, not a lawyer. He had large hands stained with grease. He spoke simply. He was not one of the elites. Lansdale saw in him the raw clay of a populist hero. Lansdale's team micromanaged every aspect of Magzis' image. It was the first modern American-style political campaign in Asia, and it was run with the precision of a military operation. When Magzis visited a village, Lansdale made sure he arrived in a jeep covered in mud, not a shiny black limousine. He made sure photographers captured Magzis jumping over puddles, shaking hands with dirty farmers, and eating with his hand sitting on the floor of a bamboo hut. Lansdale even wrote Magzis' speeches. He stripped away the flowery Spanish rhetoric that Filipino politicians usually used. He used simple direct language. He avoided the complex political theory of the communists. He spoke of family land, peace, and food. He created a catchy slogan that appeared on posters everywhere. Magzis is my guy. He commissioned songwriters to write a campaign jingle using a catchy mambo rhythm that played constantly on the radio. It was an earworm that you couldn't get out of your head. It made Magzis feel modern, exciting, and inevitable. But the Huks were not going to give up easily. They tried to boycott the election of 1953. They told the people that voting was a sham. They said that the landlords would just steal the ballot boxes like they always did. Lansdale anticipated this. He organized the National Movement for Free Elections, or NAMFL. It was ostensibly a civic group of volunteers, but it was funded and directed by the CIA. He brought in American voting machines to prevent the landlords from stuffing the ballot boxes. He organized nuns and students to guard the polling stations. The psychological effect was massive. For the first time in their lives, Filipino peasants felt that their vote might actually count. The Huk propaganda began to crumble. Why fight a revolution in the jungle if you can change the government with a ballot? Magzis won the election in a landslide. It was a crushing blow to the Huks. Their main argument that the government was a tool of the rich had been undermined by the image of the mechanic president. Magzis immediately offered amnesty to the rebels. He went on the radio and spoke directly to the men in the mountains. He said, "Come down. I will forgive you. I will give you land." This was Lansdale's masterstroke, the Economic Development Corps, or ED Corps. He took the surrendered Huks and gave them plots of land in the southern island of Mindanao. He gave them tools, seeds, and a buffalo. He turned the revolutionaries into farmers. He gave them exactly what they had been fighting for, but he gave it to them on the government's terms. The Huk army began to melt away. Men who had been hiding in the jungle for years walked out with their hands up, not because they were afraid of the vampire, but because they wanted to go home. Within 2 years, the Huk rebellion had collapsed. Louis Tarek, the supreme leader of the Huks, the man who had terrified the government, surrendered in 1954. He walked out of the jungle and shook hands with a young army officer named Benigno Aquino. The war was over, the United States had won, and they had done it without dropping a nuclear bomb or sending 100,000 troops. They had done it with vampires, eyes-in-the-sky ghost voices, and a brilliant marketing campaign. Edward Lansdale became a legend in the intelligence community. He was the man who could work miracles. He was called Colonel Landslide. He became the model for the character of Colonel Hillendale in the famous novel, The Ugly American. He was the spy who understood the power of the story. The success of the Huk campaign emboldened the CIA. They began to see Lansdale's methods as a blueprint, a magic formula that could be applied anywhere to stop communism. This dangerous confidence would lead them to their next target, a divided country in Indochina called Vietnam. In 1954, the French were defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was divided into a communist north and a pro-Western south. The United States stepped in to support the south. Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, sent for Lansdale. His orders were simple. Do what you did in Manila. Go to Saigon and work your magic. But Saigon was not Manila. Lansdale arrived and immediately started his bag of tricks. He launched a massive psychological warfare campaign against the North Vietnamese. He hired astrologers to write almanacs, predicting disaster for the communists in the north and prosperity for the south. In Vietnam, astrology is taken very seriously, and these almanacs caused genuine fear. He sent agents into Hanoi to sabotage the bus system, pouring sugar into the gas tanks to cause chaos and make the communist government look incompetent. He spread rumors that the Chinese army was going to invade and rape the women and that the United States was going to drop an atomic bomb on the north. These tactics caused a massive panic. Nearly 1 million people, mostly Catholics, fled from North Vietnam to the south. It was a huge propaganda victory for the US. It looked like 1 million people voting with their feet for freedom. But it was a movement driven largely by manufactured fear. Lansdale tried to find a Vietnamese savior. He backed Ngo Dinh Diem, the Prime Minister of South Vietnam. Diem was a rigid Catholic anti-communist. But Diem was not Mag Jai Se. Diem was aloof. He was an elitist. He refused to kiss babies or eat with farmers. He spoke French better than he spoke Vietnamese. He was a Mandarin, not a man of the people. Lansdale tried to mold him. He told him to smile more. He told him to wear traditional clothes. But Diem wouldn't listen. And the Vietnamese people didn't buy the story. The cultural connection that Lansdale had in the Philippines was missing here. Then as the war escalated in the 1960s, the CIA tried to replicate the horror tactics. They created Operation Wandering Soul. The Vietnamese people have a deep spiritual belief that if a person dies away from home and is not buried properly, their soul becomes a wandering ghost doomed to walk the earth in pain and hunger. The CIA and the US Army Psychological Operations Unit spent weeks perfecting a weapon to exploit this belief. They brought in Vietnamese folklore experts. They recorded the sounds of tigers crying babies in the wailing wind. They hired actors to scream in agony. They created what became known as Ghost Tape Number 10. You can still hear it today on the internet. It is a terrifying piece of audio. It starts with strange, distorted funeral music. Then a man's voice calls out from beyond the grave. "Daddy, Daddy, come home with me." Then the ghost voice answers. It sounds hollow and echoing. "Who is that? Who is calling me? My daughter? My wife?" The ghost then describes his death. He says, "I am dead. I am in hell. I am starving. The party lied to me. Do not follow the party. Go home." They mounted massive speakers on helicopters and flew them over the jungle canopy at night. The sound was deafening. It echoed off the trees, creating a surround sound nightmare. At first, it worked. Viet Cong soldiers were terrified, some defected. But the North Vietnamese were different from the Huks. They were more disciplined. They had been fighting for 20 years, first against the French and then against the Americans. They had political officers who quickly explained the trick. The Viet Cong realized that the ghosts were just loudspeakers. They realized that the Americans were mocking their ancestors. Instead of running away, they got angry. They started shooting at the helicopters. The ghost tape became a target indicator. The magic had worn off. The tragedy of Edward Lansdale is that he never understood why his methods failed in Vietnam. He believed that if he just had the right story, the right hero, and the right trick, he could win. He believed that human beings were programmable machines. He didn't realize that you cannot trick a people who are fighting for their own independence against a foreign occupier. In the Philippines, the Huks were fighting a Filipino government. Lansdale was just a shadow advisor. But in Vietnam, the Americans were the face of the war. They were the foreign invaders. No amount of vampire stories could hide the reality of Napalm Agent Orange and B-52 bombers. Lansdale retired from the CIA in 1956, but he continued to advise the government on counterinsurgency. He watched as the Vietnam War spiraled into a bloodbath that claimed millions of lives. He died in 1987, still believing that if they had just listened to him, they could have won. But his legacy is complicated and dark. Operation Vampire opened a Pandora's box. It legitimized the use of deception on a massive scale. It blurred the lines between combat and manipulation. It treated the enemy as culture, not as something to be understood, but as a weapon to be used against them. We see echoes of Lansdale in the conflicts of the 21st century. We see it in the Shock and Awe campaign in Iraq, which was designed to psychologically break the enemy before the invasion even started. We see it in the use of heavy metal music, blasted at prisoners in Guantanamo Bay to break their will. We see it in the sophisticated memes and disinformation campaigns used by intelligence agencies today to destabilize governments without firing a shot. The core idea remains the same. If you can control the enemy's reality, you can control the enemy, but there is a cost. When you weaponize a culture's beliefs, you are committing a deep violation. You are taking the things they hold sacred, their fears, their spirits, their ancestors, and turning them into tools of war. You are polluting their collective dreams. The vampire of Luzon was a lie, but the fear it caused was real. The dead man on the trail was real, and the impact on the history of Southeast Asia was real. As we conclude this story, let us return to that dark jungle trail one last time. Imagine the silence after the commandos left, the body of the young rebel hanging there drained and pale in the moonlight, the insects buzzing around him, the bats circling overhead. It is a scene that belongs in a horror movie. But it is history. It is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones with fangs and wings. They are not the ancient demons of folklore. The true monsters are the men wearing suits sitting in air-conditioned offices in Washington, D.C. or Langley, Virginia, deciding that a human life is just a prop in a story. Deciding that terror is just another tool in the toolbox. Edward Lansdale won his war in the Philippines. But in doing so, he taught the world a dark lesson. He taught us that in the modern age, the scariest thing in the dark is not a ghost. It is a psyop. This is John. This is the Untold History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.